Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez, and every year I try to make a video for my students that walks you through all of the different parts and components of your research paper. So this particular video is geared for Psych 4370, Social Work 4370, and it is for the non-experimental class. So if you happen to be on this video and you're in the 4371 class, you're watching the wrong video. It's not necessarily that this video isn't going to help you, but it is only oriented at non-experimental methods and procedures. So I'm making this video in anticipation of the midterm of our semester, which is the summer semester. You've done about 3 or 4 assignments depending on where you're at watching this video. And in those 3 or 4 assignments, we've covered most of the components of the first part of your paper. We haven't gotten into statistics yet, so the data analysis and the results discussion portion of this paper aren't going to be relevant. And to be honest, I don't really go over them in class because that's the application portion of this course. So if you want a full overview of what's expected for you for this paper, I highly suggest you watch this entire video in however it works for you. If you watch it in one session, if you break it into pieces, whatever works for you. In Canvas, you'll also find a hypothetical example of a research paper that I've written that will provide you an example of each one of the portions of this template. So what you should see on your screen in front of you is the template for the paper. You'll notice that it says project title, student name, University of Houston, Clear Lake, my name, and then the title of the class or the code for the class. So the first thing that you're going to do on your paper is you're going to write your project title here. Now, some people choose to write their research question. Some people choose to write it in a different form. So I'm going to show you guys where I have the research paper example. So if you pull up the example research paper, you'll see on the first page here, it says the association between sleep chronotype and sleep quality in university professors. That's the title that I've given to my example paper. But my research question is a little bit different. So it doesn't matter, whatever works for you. Okay. So let's go back to the template and look. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your title there. You're going to write your name, and then you're going to move on to the next page. Now, we're going to skip writing the abstract for now because ideally the abstract needs to be written at the end of the project. So we're going to go through the template and then we'll come back to the abstract. So you'll notice on the first page of your actual template here, it says paper title. You're going to repeat whatever title you used on the title page. When you type it in, make sure that the formatting stays the same. And if you have a question or you feel like the formatting has gotten messed up, you can easily pull up that example paper and you can see where things are supposed to be. So you can see here, I can put these side by side, maybe. I can put these side by side and you see that paper title, it's centered, it's in bold, and then over here in the PDF of the example, it's centered and it's in bold. Okay? So you don't need to write a subheading underneath here that says introduction. Under APA style guidelines, in a student paper, it's implied that the first thing after the paper title is the introduction, okay? So you do not need a subheading for that section. Primarily, your introduction is going to have 3 components. It's going to have the mini literature review that you've been working on. It's going to have a repetition of your research question, and it's going to have a general hypothesis for your study. And I'm going to show you how those things are supposed to be written in just a few moments. So as we've gone over in the classes and the lectures, literature reviews are really essential to writing a good research proposal. A literature review is justifying what research has already been conducted and why your research needs to be conducted. So effectively, what you're doing is painting a picture of the research landscape, and you're doing that by describing all of the previous research that you feel is pertinent to include and their corresponding results. So in that literature review, you're introducing topics, concepts, and critical information that your reader needs in order to understand your project. Now, when you're writing a dissertation or a thesis, these are long literature reviews. In my graduate work for my doctoral dissertation, we had a semester, or actually a trimester, that was dedicated to just the literature review, because you'll find that even though you are doing a research project with a clear research question, there is always a ton of research out there, and you've got to weed through that research and decide what is beneficial to your story and what isn't. And that is a long process. There's a whole chapter in the Baldwin book dedicated to doing a literature review. Now, thankfully, this is a short class. If you're taking this during the summer, it's even shorter. You've only got 8 weeks. So I'm not expecting you to write a full literature review. But even though your review is shorter and less comprehensive, it does need to introduce your topic. It does need to justify why you're doing this. And it does need to relate back to your research question. So to get started, I would refer you back to the first assignment that you did. This is where you picked 5 articles and you summarized them. At the same time, I want you to go back and reread Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 from Baldwin. That chapter, Chapter 2 specifically, focuses on how to write a literature review. Now, make sure your articles are peer-reviewed. Include the journal articles you've already found. And by the time you get to writing your research paper, you should have built up about 10 to 15 research journal articles. Those can also include articles for your measurements, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a few moments. You're going to start writing, and you're going to start telling the story of why you want to study this particular research topic. So you're going to use what's called the funnel method. And in that funnel method, you start with a broad conceptual view of your research topics, and you're going to effectively drill down to your specific research question. Now, as you're writing, you should make sure that you are thinking ahead towards your research question. You're going to make sure that you cite your sources using APA style, and you can use that APA style guide to help you. And you're going to make sure that every article you've used has in-text citations and has a corresponding reference in your reference section. So in other words, every article that you've talked about is listed in the references, and every reference that you've listed in the reference section is mentioned in your paper, okay? Every article that you use needs that in-text citation and that corresponding reference. Now, if you've got 1 or 2 authors, you're going to list both of them. And you can go back and look at Chapter 8 of your APA manual, and it will tell you specifically how to cite with those in-text citations. There's basically 3 different ways you can do it. Now, if you've got 3 or more authors, you can use the abbreviation in Latin et al. Now, I know there's some discrepancy in my notes. This is because this is changing every time APA comes out with a new version. It takes us old school people like myself time to catch up. And in the past, you couldn't list et al. The first time you cite a paper in your writing. You can now. So basically, I'm not going to dock you if you do either way. So go back and review assignment number 1. Make sure you've incorporated any suggested changes that I've given you. If you decide to copy and paste, make sure you right-click on your mouse and you go under these paste options. And right here at the end, there should be another option. I don't have anything on my clipboard right now, but it will be paste text only. You want to do that because if you paste it directly, it's going to merge the formatting between whatever source you're using and this paper, and it's going to mess you all up. Now, you're going to logically structure this review as you go. You need to keep in mind that you're going to end by introducing your research question. When you've reached that point, you start a new paragraph, you introduce your research question directly, and then you're also going to introduce your hypotheses in generic language. And I'm going to show you an example of what that means. Now, Baldwin, the book Baldwin, is an excellent source. That's why I included it as a required text for this class. So, if you look at the Baldwin text, you'll see that chapter 2 talks about how to write or how to do a research literature review. And then chapter 3 talks about organizing your ideas and creating a thesis. And then chapter 4 talks about structuring and drafting your paper. And that's mainly what we're going to be concentrating on in this book. You're also going to talk about chapter 6, managing the citations. But there's a lot of wonderful tips and hints in Baldwin, especially if you're considering going to graduate school. I would hang on to that book. Things that I do recommend and things that I don't recommend, and this is in general for the entire paper. The UHCL Writing Center is a wonderful resource. They can help you at any point to write an excellent paper, whether you go to them from the beginning and say, hey, I want some help getting this off the ground and I'm going to come back to you consistently throughout the rest of the summer, or maybe you've already written your paper and you want to polish it. I do not recommend using AI at any point in the writing process. Can you bounce ideas through ChatGPT? Absolutely. Can you ask ChatGPT if you're on the right track? Sure. But do not feed your paper to it or feed it a source and tell it to summarize it. I promise you, your writing is going to come off better when it comes from you. I would much rather a slightly poorly written paper that came directly from your fingertips than something that you copied and pasted from AI, okay? Be wary of other sources that claim to help you polish your writing. Let's Grammarly, for example. Sometimes if you run things through Grammarly, it'll suggest fixing things. Those fixings are bad as far as AI is concerned, because your paper will then be marked with structural components and other hints that generally indicate AI was used. Can you bounce ideas off of ChatGPT? Absolutely. Can you ask ChatGPT to give you an example of something based on the requirements for the paper? Absolutely. But the moment when your fingertips hit that keyboard and start writing that component of the paper, it needs to be coming from you, okay? This is your intellectual property. If you're considering going to graduate school and this topic is something near and dear to your heart, this may actually become the very first draft of something that could develop into a dissertation. So be proud of it and own it. This is your intellectual product. So if you want more help to see how that paper should be written, especially this introduction and literature review, please look at my example. So let's pull that up and talk about that. So I start by talking about how sleep is an essential function to health and well-being, because this particular research question is about sleep, okay? So I've gone and I've talked about previous research that has explored the relationship between sleep and your health, whether that be physical health or mental health. So I talked about a study that associated sleep quality with better general health and physical outcomes. I talked about how sleep quality has been associated with negative cardiovascular outcomes and can be used to predict your physical health as it declines in a cardiovascular patient. And you can see I have cited those with in-text citations. Okay, so in my references, there should be a citation, a reference for Hardy and Lamont, and there should be a reference for Shen et al. I've also talked about how better sleep quality is associated with a higher quality of life, including physical, psychological, social, environmental components. I cited that. I talked about the association between sleep quality and mental health, and I provided examples of that. I talked about sleep quality in children. I talked about sleep quality in university students. So I finished that writing by saying there's a consistently demonstrated link between sleep, physical health, and mental health, and that sleep quality is an important component to research, because that's basically what I'm telling you. I'm selling you the idea that sleep research, especially this research that I'm proposing, is important. I moved into the second part of my paper, which is focusing on sleep chronotype, which is a person's preference for a certain type of day to do certain activities, like things that require you to be awake versus things that require you to be asleep. And I described what a morning person and an evening or a night owl might be in terms of layman's terms, and how that relates to this scientific term, which is sleep chronotype. Then I went and I reviewed the research on it. I talked about how there is an association between different sleep chronotypes and depression in university students, that they found different chronotypes are associated with different outcomes and patterns in adolescence. I talk about how the evening chronotype is associated with higher issues in mental health, like depression and anxiety and poor sleep quality, because that's what I'm getting at. My specific population is university professors. So I'm going on a limb right here and even telling people that they've done a study before. Lahoud et al. In 2026 did a study on sleep chronotype. They associated it with depression and anxiety, and they found that different sleep chronotypes reported different sleep quality. This was just then a sample of adults. I want to specifically narrow that down this time because I'm studying college professors. So I built my case for why sleep chronotype is important. Then I moved into a paragraph that talks about how there's different sleep patterns and sleep quality across different groups, certain professional careers, and I have a citation for that as well. Then I talk about why I'm studying this particular population. University professors are a group of professionals where there is a lacking of research. There is no research that I could find that talked about sleep chronotype and sleep quality in professors. Now, if you have a research question and you know there's a study out there on it, that's okay, because this, again, is a class. It's not like you're writing a dissertation here. So roll with it. Go with it. You have a question, ask me. Now I've drilled down. I've talked about sleep chronotype. I've talked about sleep quality. I'm going to introduce my research question and my basic hypotheses. So I go into this last paragraph here and I talk about how this is my research question. Is there an association between sleep chronotype and sleep quality in university professors? Then I talk about my hypothesis using words, not the null and alternative hypothesis format that you'll see later in the paper. I talk about how my general hypothesis is that nighttime sleep chronotype, or in other words, being a night owl, is going to be associated with worse sleep quality in university professors. That's instinctual, but there's research up there that I've summarized that actually backs that up. So if somebody found that sleep chronotype, the nighttime chronotype in particular, is associated with negative sleep outcomes in university students or in adults or in children with ADHD, then I can go out on a limb and say, based on the previous research, there's every indication that I'm going to find a negative association in my population as well. So then you can summarize your hypothesis just in words here. So I said, in other words, participants preferring evening or nighttime for wakefulness activities will have worse sleep patterns, worse sleep quality than participants that prefer morning time. Now, after you've finished that introduction, which includes the literature review, the introduction of your question, and the introduction of your hypothesis, you're going to move into the methodology section of your paper. Read this section really carefully. Don't delete or modify any of the parts that I've created for you. That method section, or the methodology section, it's going to have several different subheaders. The headers and the paragraphs that I've listed are formatted for you. So if you delete a section or modify the headers or the paragraphs, you may end up messing up your formatting, and you don't want that to happen. But if that happens, you can go back to Chapter 2 of the APA Style Guide. Specifically, I thought I had put the page numbers in here, but it is in Chapter 2. But reference the student paper in there, and it'll show you exactly how the pieces are supposed to be laid out as far as headers are concerned. So remember, each section of this part of the paper is tailored to provide your reader with specific information about that header. So the first section of the methodology is going to be study design. That's what I covered up here, study design. I kind of introduced all this stuff here, but you are focusing on a non-experimental research study, so you need to mention the word non-experimental, you need to mention the word association claim, and you need to mention a correlation in your study methodology. So start that section off by restating your research question, okay? And then describe what type of non-experimental study you're using, and that is an association study or a correlational study. But you also need to get into the methodology behind your study. Are you doing an observational study where you count certain things? Are you doing a survey like I am proposing in this paper? You need to tell me that. Is your study longitudinal? Does that mean, are you tracking participants over time? Whatever the case is, you need to describe that methodology using the definitions and terminology that we went over in class. So let's look at what that looks like in the research paper. So when you get down to study design, I say that this research question, and I repeat it, okay? Now, I'm talking about how my study uses a quantitative, because I'm collecting numbers, non-experimental research design, exploring the relationship between sleep chronotype and sleep quality. That relationship indicates association, so that's fine. I could have said explore the association between sleep chronotype and sleep quality. I talk about how these are both naturally occurring variables and that my study is examining the relationship between those two variables. And because I'm not manipulating sleep chronotype, this is clearly non-experimental. So justify your research methodology. I'm talking about how study data is collected at one point in time, so it is not longitudinal. Then I'm justifying this. I said this survey methodology is appropriate because both variables are measured using self-reported data. The data is gathered in a numerical form using two common measurement tools, so it's clearly quantitative. It's correlational, so it's attempting to identify whether there's an association between two variables, but because it's non-experimental, I cannot establish a causal relationship. And then I clarified that in my last sentence. I said, in other words, the study is not designed to establish whether a particular sleep chronotype actually causes better or poorer sleep quality. Now let's go back over to the template and look at the next portion. In the next part of your paper, you're going to talk about your variables and operational definitions. So in this section, you're going to write about those two things. You're going to remember that non-experimental studies have a dependent variable, but a non-manipulated independent variable. In other words, your independent variable is occurring in a natural state without any manipulation or modification on the part of the researcher, okay? So you're going to have a paragraph and you're going to start with your independent variable. It's a concept and a corresponding conceptual definition. So list the concept, give me the corresponding conceptual definition, and then tell me how you operationally defined it. That operational definition is important because you're going to justify how you're measuring it and justify why that study is included. And I told you right here to look at the paper for more information. We'll go over that in a minute. When you're done with the independent variable, you're going to do the same thing with your dependent variable in a new paragraph. Start with the concept itself, then the conceptual definition, then provide the operational definition and justify it. Then your third part of your variable section is going to talk about control variables that you have identified. This is one of those parts where you could go bounce some ideas off of ChatGPT. Get ChatGPT to engage you in a back and forth conversation about what control variables would be useful in this study. That is a totally appropriate use of AI. But when you go back to your paper to write it in your own words. Now, I told you need to justify why those variables need to be controlled and to look at the example paper for information. So let's go over here and look at it. So I talk about how this study, the non-manipulated independent variable, is going to be sleep chronotype. I conceptually define that as a person's individual preference for waking activities. So when do you prefer to do things that require you to be awake, like go to class or to work? Then I'm going to operationally define that. And I'm going to introduce my measures here because my operational definition is based on those measures. You may not need to do that. You may have a situation where you're able to define this in a different way. So don't worry about it. I know what I'm pulling mine off of, so that's why I reference the Morningness, Eveningness Questionnaire by Horn and Otzberg, published in 1976. Which is a self-reported questionnaire where a person answers some questions and it classifies them as a morning person, a non-preferential person, or an evening person, okay? And then I talk about what those things mean. So, for example, a person as a morning person has a preference for conducting their waking activities in the morning. A night owl has a preference for their waking activities during the evening or nighttime hours. Now, talk about how I'm using that measure there because I need to use my measure at the beginning when I recruit my people into the study in order to put them in their sleep chronotype, like in order to do my analysis, okay? I'm justifying this variable because multiple researchers have already studied it, and I know it can be effectively studied by collecting data using that tool. Then I go into my dependent variable, which for this study, it is sleep quality. I tell my reader that conceptually, this is just an overall quality of a person's sleep. You can see how that could easily be misinterpreted across different people. So I move into my operational definition, which is directly based off of a measurement tool, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSYC. And then I reference it. This is from PSYC et al. In 1989. Then I talk about what it is because that helps the person understand how I came to my conceptual and operational definitions. So it's got subjective and objective measures of a person's sleep. It gathers data on a myriad of different aspects of sleep, including their subjective sleep quality, their sleep latency, which is how long it takes for them to fall asleep after they lay down, sleep duration, which is how long they sleep, habitual sleep efficiency, which that might be measured by asking them how well and how rested they feel the next day. So a person with efficient sleep would report feeling well rested. Sleep disturbances, how many times they wake up during the night, etc., whether or not they use sleep medication, and daytime dysfunction, which is how well they're able to function the next day after they sleep. And then I talk about how this variable is justified in its inclusion because sleep quality is an important component in overall physical and mental health of the general population, and it's also been well studied. I didn't include that little tidbit, but I should have. Then I go into my control variables, and I actually went over to ChatGPT and I asked it, I don't know why I called it a him, but I said, hey, this is my research question. What are some possible controls or confounding variables that I need to control for in this study? And it spat out about 50 different things. Well, I picked about 4 of them that I thought would be the most, justifiable. And I talked about them in my own words. The first one was caffeine intake. Now, how am I controlling for that? I can't tell my participants to stop using caffeine after 2 p.m., but I can ask them about their caffeine intake after 2 p.m., and I can use that as a covariate in my statistical analyses, okay? And I talked about why that was important, because if you consume caffeine in the late afternoon, evening, or night, it can affect your sleep. So I'm going to collect data on that consumption, and I might include it as a covariate in my analyses. I also talked about the disclosure of a diagnosed sleep disorder by the participant. That makes logical sense. If I'm talking about sleep, I need to know if my participants have sleep disorders. So I may need to eliminate a participant altogether if they have narcolepsy. But I describe what that is and how it might impact my participant, and then by collecting that data, I can control for it in my statistical analysis. Usually the 2 ways of controlling for these confounds are either going to be eliminate that person from your data analysis or to control for it as a covariate in your statistical analyses. The third variable was the diagnosis of a mental health condition such as anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Why? These are frequently reported as comorbidities. So a person who has a sleep disturbance may also have anxiety, depression, or something else. So again, I'm going to collect that info and I may adjust for that covariance in my statistical analysis. And then my last control was employment status. And the reason why I include that is because in a university setting, you generally have two types of professors. You have tenure track or tenured professors who are full-time, and then you have people like me who are adjuncts, who teach 1 or 2 classes per semester. So that means most adjunct professors generally hold another full-time employment outside of the university. I included that because my thought process was that if I'm having to work a whole nother job, that might increase time demands and possibly sleep hours. So your demands and the hours you sleep may be different based on your employment status. I'm going to collect that data and I will control for it in my analysis if it becomes necessary. Let's move into the next section of your paper. So the next section of your paper, you're going to discuss your hypotheses and you're going to write them in the specific format that I have described for you down here. Start by restating that research question. You're going to get tired of writing it, but it's important that you do. Immediately afterwards, you're going to write your null and alternative hypotheses using this format down here. I also suggest that if your hypothesis is one-tailed, tell me the direction and tell me why. So the null is going to say something like there is no difference, remove the highlighting when you write, and then the alternative is going to say there is a difference. Immediately following those hypotheses, you're going to explain them using words in a paragraph. I know in the template right here, this is not much of a paragraph, but you can see over here in the actual paper that there is. So I restated my research question. I listed my hypothesis. There's no association here. And then my alternative is that there is an association. And then because it's one-tailed, I specifically said that evening chronotype is associated with poor sleep. Underneath that, I just go into an explanation of those two hypotheses. I'm telling my readers that chronotype can be one of these 3 categories. Previous research has associated them with poor sleep quality in other populations. So my null simply says there's no difference. And then conversely, my alternative says that there is a difference, and specifically because it's one-tailed, I'm looking for worse sleep quality in evening chronotypes. And then I explain why. The idea behind that is that a night owl prefers to work at night, and that requires them to be awake in the evening and night. And that preference overlaps when times when society expects them to be sleeping. Okay. So while society says I should sleep from, 11 to 7 a.m., me being a night owl, that's my peak performance time. But the problem with that is that societal demands require you to operate within this normal 9 to 5 schedule. So by forcing us night owls to engage in these wakefulness activities at a time that I don't prefer, we suffer more, which leads to worse sleep quality. And I just explained all that in words. That's all you need to do for that section. Now let's talk about participants in sampling. In this portion of your paper, you're going to describe the population of interest, the participants, and your sampling techniques. I would address your population and sample in one big paragraph, and then in a separate one, I would talk about your sampling technique. Now, you had a sampling assignment, and you were asked to describe 2 possible techniques. Don't list both of those techniques. You only need one, okay? Pick one, elaborate on it, and look at the paragraphs. It says look at the paragraphs below, but you're going to actually look at the paragraph in the example paper. So let me fix that real quick. And then the paragraphs above give you general guidance. Make sure you also talk about why the sampling method you chose is appropriate for your study. So underneath here, I talk about how I'm looking at university professors. Why am I interested in them? They have variable work demands. Sometimes adjuncts have more than one job. There's a lot of different responsibilities. And those demands coupled with a preference for when you want to do your wakeful activities could impact your sleep quality. I talk about how my sample will come from professors, adjuncts, and full-time employed by one of the universities composing the University of Houston system. I'm going to exclude people that are not professors. So I'm going to exclude graduate students, even though they may be giving classes. I'm still going to exclude them. I'm going to exclude staff, and I'm going to exclude administrators without teaching responsibilities. Then I talk about how I'm going to basically recruit them. I'm going to recruit them based on their availability and willingness to participate. Therefore, this is a sample of convenience, or I am using a convenience sample methodology. Where am I going to get my participants? Publicly available directories, departmental websites, professional contacts. Participants are going to be contacted. They get a recruitment email talking about the study, blah, blah, blah. And then if they decide to participate, there's a link. I'll send out a follow-up reminder. It's a convenient sample. They're recruited from everybody that's available to me, the researcher. They are giving voluntary responses. So this is also called voluntary response sampling, because if you don't volunteer to be in the study, you're not in it, okay? I'm also going to go out and talk about how this is not random sampling. And because it's not random sampling, there could be some forms of bias. And the bias that I talked about was over-representing professors who are actually interested in sleep or health or just being a good research participant. But I also justify that by saying that in non-experimental research, when you're looking at association claims, that is an acceptable method. There's a mistake right here. This measurement tools, it should be backed over. So I'm going to go over here. It's fixed in your template, but in my paper, there's a boo-boo there. So under the next section, under measurement tools, you're going to talk about the tools that you're going to use to collect your data. One of your assignments asked you to look at some measurement tools, so you should know what you're going to use already. Another assignment, you came up with a short demographic survey. So in this section, you're going to talk about the tool that you picked, as well as any demographic or researcher-produced tools that you're going to use to gather descriptive, demographic, or other relevant data. Separated into paragraphs that are relevant, okay? So I talk about how in my study I've got 2 measures, so I address each of them in a separate paragraph, and then in a third paragraph I address my demographic and descriptive survey. You need to make sure you include a relevant reference and in-text citation. So I couldn't remember if this was in assignment 2 or 3, but you have an assignment on this. So if you go back and look at my paper, yes, there's a mistake right there, but I talked about how I'm going to use 2 validated measures. The first one is the morningness, eveningness questionnaire, and then I cite it, okay? And then I talk about what's in it. It's 19 questions that assesses if you're active and alert at different times of the day, so it helps me identify your sleep chronotype. I talk about how it's self-report. Takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete, and it's only going to be completed once. And all of that information should be information that you can gather from that citation that you pulled for the assignment that you previously done. I talk about how it's undergone testing to ensure that it's reliable and valid, and it produces a global score. It uses Likert and timescale questions, and then those scores are converted to 1 of 5 chronotypes, and I talk about how that is right there, and I referenced that measure again because I felt like I needed to, because I specifically told what chronotypes it identifies. I did the same thing for my second tool, which is the PSYC. I referenced it again, and then I talked about the same information. I also talked about how the higher score tells me that your sleep quality is worse. Okay, and it's been thoroughly validated and shown to be reliable through a lot of rigorous testing, so I made sure to mention that and to cite it again. Then in my last paragraph, I talk about how I'm going to collect some demographic and descriptive data, especially about those control variables, because I need to know that information, but it's not included in my measures, so I'm going to use a short research-made questionnaire. I talk about general demographics. You don't have to list them all out, but give me a picture. Age, gender, employment status, your subjective health. Are you a healthy person? Your mental health, diagnosed health conditions, diagnosed mental health conditions, caffeine consumption, because that was one of my control variables. And I also threw in alcohol and illicit substance consumption and prescription medication use. Why? Those are important things I might need to control for. I see another error right here. Validity should have been backed over, but I believe it is fixed in the template. It is. So in the next section, you're going to address 3 types of validity that are important for non-experimental research, and that's going to be external, statistical, and construct validity. We're making association claims, so you can leave off internal validity, but you should recognize that your measurement tools have been validated for internal validity. In any case, you're going to pull that information from your validity assignment, and in the end, you should have 3 detailed paragraphs, each one addressing a specific validity. In each paragraph, you're going to tell me a general definition of the validity, identify the threats in your study, and tell me how you're going to address them, which is what you should have done in the assignment. So this should not be a hard part either. So under validity here, I talk about my external validity, how that is the ability to generalize my results. I list out my threats and I tell how I'm going to address them. You can go and read that on your own. I also talked about construct validity in the same terms. And then I talked about statistical validity. And you'll notice I've got 3 very large paragraphs there. I had some people in the past try to tell me about their statistical validity with 2 sentences. You definitely need more than 2 sentences, okay? Let's move on to the procedures part, because this is a part that you have not addressed yet in your assignments. So in the procedure section, it's going to be new, and you're telling the reader a description of your procedures. You're going to describe them in detail, starting at the very beginning. So think about questions like, what steps would the participant have to do when completing your study? Think from the perspective of a participant. Write as many paragraphs as you wish, but start by covering IRB, your informed consent, then go into your data collection procedures. You also want to mention confidentiality and anonymity if those are applicable. Confidentiality should be, but anonymity might not. And then this is really your time to shine and tell me how you would actually carry out the research. I look forward to reading this portion because this is a portion that you've not submitted to me yet in your assignments. So you can go back and read my procedure in the example paper. You can see it's several paragraphs. I start saying that I'm using human subjects, so I have to go through IRB, talk about what a little bit about IRB would include. After I get it, I talk about my recruitment. Then I talk about how after I recruit them, if they want to participate, they click on a link. It takes them to the survey. Go back and read this, and it will tell you a very detailed protocol on how data would be collected. This is another place where you can bounce ideas off of an AI like ChatGPT, okay? Next, you're going to move into what is also a new portion of your paper, the analytic plan. Now, because you're not collecting data, you're not going to have any results. In this section, you're going to tell me the descriptive statistics and the inferential statistics you would use to analyze your data. You're going to include talking about frequency, your central tendency, your variability for your variables and how they relate back to your hypotheses. For inferential statistics, all of these research questions that you've proposed should be able to be addressed with either a Pearson or a Spearman correlation. Only use statistics that we've covered in class, or if you have an idea for another statistic, please email me. I just want to make sure we're on the right track. Make sure you tell me what the statistic is that we're using, Pearson correlation, how you would calculate it using Jamovi, your significance level, P is less than 0.05 to make your decisions. Tell me if it's one-tailed or two-tailed, and then tell me what situations would make you retain or reject your null based on your p-value. I don't know why this went down there, so I need to get that back up on your template. There you go. Let's look at what that looks like over here in my paper, analytic plan. At this point, I've collected my data, okay? I will analyze it, and then I talk about my analysis, I talk about Pearson's R, I talk about my descriptive stats, standard deviation range, medium, range, minimum, maximum, etc. Talk about how I'm going to use scatter plots to look at a linear association. If I don't see a linear association, I need to go back and do a Spearman's correlation. I talk about how my hypothesis is one-tailed. I talk about my alpha level. You can go back and read all of that. Then I get down here and I repeat my null and my alternative, and I talk about when I'm going to reject or fail to reject, okay? And then your final portion of the paper that you're going to write is your discussion. Again, you do not have data, so you're going to interpret those data, what you would do with the data if you had them. You're going to tell me if your results supported your hypothesis. How does this help us understand human behavior? Specifically, my paper, how do I understand sleep? If it didn't support it, what would you do? You're going to use those existing empirical studies from your literature review to discuss the implications, and I'm going to show you what that means in a minute. You're going to also acknowledge the limitations of your study, because no study is perfect and there are always things we can do better. So tell me those limitations. What might you modify? How could you structure a follow-up? What would your next hypothesis be? Should be 4 or 5 short paragraphs, and you're going to follow the structure for a discussion in an empirical paper. And you can see what that looks like in the example here. So I repeated the purpose of my study, right? And then I repeated my hypotheses. Then I talk about what happens if it supports it. And I back that up with some of the research that I found. So if I find that my hypothesis is true, my alternative is true, that would be consistent with what the other researchers have found. Lahoud and Whitehead and Horton found that an evening chronotype is associated with worse sleep. It was just in different populations. How would that help? It will bolster the current knowledge out there about sleep, about biological sleep rhythms, and how they relate to our daily functioning and our well-being. Then I talk about if results support my hypothesis, how it's got practical implications, maybe not schedule professors to come in early in the morning. I don't know. I go into that. You can read about it in there. I also relate it back to a couple of studies. I also talk about if my results don't support the alternative, it's not the end of the world. There could have been other reasons for that. Maybe professors are better at adapting. I don't know. I related it back to other studies that I found. Maybe the results are better explained with other factors rather than just sleep chronotype. And so I might need to do a regression analysis in the future. I talk about the limitations, specifically that this is correlational in nature. It's non-experimental. I can't get at causality. I talk about how it relies on self-reported data, which is always questionable in some ways. There could be social desirability. You're going to look at this example and you'll see what I need you to write. Okay? Then you're going to get into the last part, which is your reference section. I just put a few examples in here to hold like a placeholder. Okay? That should be in italics right there. But you will need to delete these, and actually this should be a hanging indent. I don't know why it flipped them around. I'll have to fix that. But that basically gives you an idea of what your paper is going to look like after you're done. I want to fix this real quick before I publish it so you don't have it all messed up. See how easy it is to fix these things? You just go in like that. Now I can save your template and I can publish this to Canvas so you'll see it. After you've written your paper, you're going to go back and write that abstract. An abstract is about 150 words, and it's a summary of everything. It talks about how I'm proposing a non-experimental correlational research study. I'm looking at the association between these two variables in this particular population. I talk about why this is important. I talk about what I'm going to do. I'm going to gather data with these two things. I'm going to analyze them using correlational statistics. Then I talk about how my results might be useful in the future. 150 words. I believe this is about 140 right here. So I'm going to go back in and fix my mistakes that I found in my example paper so that you don't see those mistakes that I had earlier with those headings. And I will publish this along with this video in Canvas. If you have questions, let me know. Please don't wait until the end of the semester to start working on this. At the end of June, you will have pretty much the first half of this paper written. If you start plugging in your pieces now, you will end up in that last week of class only needing to write those 2 sections, the data analysis plan and the discussion, and you will be good. So again, reach out if you have any questions, and take care. Bye.